The Committee of the Whole is called to order. I'd like to introduce the panel that have joined me this morning. To my left is Tony Babalta, the Chief of Staff of the Governor of Guam. To my right, my immediate right, is Lester Carlson, the Director of BBMR. And to his right is the Director of the Department of Administration, Mr. Edward Byrne. Note, the panel was sworn in prior to the beginning of this Committee of the Whole. I'd like to introduce the sponsor and the sponsors to make their opening statement. Madam Speaker.
Manana Sitos, Mr. Chair, and Sitos Masi for giving me the opportunity to open on this bill 181-35 COR, which is an act to add a new Article 13 to Chapter 1, Division 1 of Title 5 Guam Code annotated relative to compensating adjudicated claims of the greatest generation of Guam for the atrocities suffered during World War II occupation of Guam. Mr. Chair, in a concerted effort working with the administration and our colleagues in the legislature, Bill 181-35 COR was introduced to expedite the Guam World War II Loyalty Recognition Act, which you know and my colleagues know is U.S. Public Law 114-328. Mr. Chair, this bill does a couple of things, and I want to share with you that it creates the 75th Guam Liberation War Claims Fund, and it authorizes the governor to transfer a sum not exceeding $7.5 million from the FY 2019 appropriations for the purposes of compensating war survivors with an adjudicated claim. I want to share with you, Mr. Chair, that upon passing, the Leon Guerrero Tenorio administration will execute an MOA with the Trump administration that sets out the administrative process to pay awards that will protect the privacy of the individual and prevent double payments of an award. We also received assurances from the administration through the fiscal note that the executive branch is anticipating lapses to be utilized for the 75th Guam Liberation War Claims Fund. And Mr. Chair, the fiscal note is a part of the committee report, and it too specifically lays out what I just mentioned earlier. And I want to say that I think all my colleagues, I want to thank all my colleagues for their support and their effords. Legislative Secretary Amanda Shelton, Senator Amanda Shelton, and Minority Leader Senator Will Castro for helping me be co-sponsors on this legislation. I want to take the time to thank all the war survivors, our manamkos. I want to say Dunklun Asitus Masi for all the delegates over the years for continuing to push this effort forward. I'd be remiss if I didn't share them from Congressman Antonio Wampat, Congressman Ben Blas, Congressman Robert Underwood, of course, Congresswoman Madeline Z. Berdalio, and now to present Congressman Mike San Nicolas. I want to share with you and to the listening audience, Mr. Chair, that every day since I took office, a war survivor has come up to me to speak to me about war reparations. And just yesterday, I had a young lady call on behalf of her mother asking and saying, you know, my mother was just asking, she's 86 years old, and she was just asking, would that claim ever be awarded to her? You know, Mr. Chair, every day counts for our sinus and our Renamco. I want to say to you that if the ball is in our court, it is important that we make the move to move forward on this. It is important that we do what is right by our Manamco. And I want to say that in working closely with the administration, I understand that there may be some questions regarding this bill that have been brought up. So for the sake of the body and for clarification purposes, Mr. Chair, I want to also pose some of the following questions to the panel. And I want to thank the administration, our Magahaga, for bringing the Chief of Staff and letting him join us today. Mr. Tony Babauta, thank you. And one of the first questions, I have 3 questions, and I have an amendment to proffer if it need be. And it would say, the first question is, can we get a summary of the administration's communications with the U.S. federal government on how they intend for this program to be administered, specifically what agencies you have been in communications with, as well as the extent of the conversations, beginning with our draft bill sent to you on June 17th, and then your updates received by our committee on by our office on July 18th. And while the funds will come out of Guam's monies anyway, the Section 30 set aside, how can we ensure that the government of Guam will be repaid? And then I want to state for the record that no amount, Mr. Chair, no amount of money would be enough to compensate our survivors for what they've went through. But I must note, however, that how can we ensure that there will be some accountability so that the individuals are not double paid? And I know that these questions were also brought up at the public hearing process, and I know that the communication working closely with the administration has been detailed. So those are my questions I pose to the panel. But again, I want to thank everybody from the administration for being here and hoping they can answer the questions so that our colleagues can hear. Si Juas Masi. And then after that, I will proffer my amendment.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Before I ask the panel to answer that, let me just state the rules of engagement right after that one, ma'am.
Okay.
Rules of engagement for this committee of the whole. There'll be 2 rounds of questions. Members are allowed 5 minutes, not including the response. Okay, and then after all the questions have been answered, the panel will be dismissed, and then 4 amendments must be submitted in writing and distributed on the floor. Okay? So, yes, ma'am.
I have a point of inquiry, Mr. Chairman. I'm wondering why there has been no representative from the Congressman's office present at the panel, because I believe that the matter is relevant to action on HR 1365, and they should be in an authority to speak for their office.
Mr.
Speaker, can you?
I just want to note for the record and courtesy of working continually to also engage with the Congressman's office. We've tried to communicate as late as yesterday, but we have not received a response back call from our office to their office. And I did know that he was here last week, but I'm not sure if he's still here. But I did extend a courtesy call out to him to see if he wanted to be here today, but we did not get a response. But I can double check to see if there's any communication from him, his office this morning.
Okay, thank you, Madam Speaker. Senator Torres, I understand your question. It would have been best if he was here, but...
Or any representative. I mean, we have, for example, the Chief of Staff of the executive branch present. And so, you know, I'm sure that there are people, short of the Congressman's presence himself, that can speak on behalf of the office. I would think that they have a Guam office and that a representative can be afforded to us, unless they so decline, and that's all I'm concerned about.
I'll have somebody contact his office and see if he can still make it over. Okay? I'll now ask the... You want... I'm happy to... Tony, if you can.
Well, thank you very much for the questions. And on behalf of the administration, I know the governor is very appreciative of all the work that the Guam Legislature is doing to consider the legislation that would create the Guam War Claims Fund and also offer her provide her the authority to transfer into the funds so that the administration can carry out a local war claims awards program. But she's especially thankful to the Speaker and to Senator Amanda Shelton, and also the Minority Leader Will Castro for the bipartisan effort in sponsoring and co-sponsoring the legislation and giving it the attention from the body. With respect to the Speaker's questions, the first one, a summary and updates, which I think essentially you're asking which federal agencies has the administration been interacting with over the course of many months. So they have been specifically the White House and White House Intergovernmental Affairs, who's led by Doug Horschel, who's a special assistant to the president and is by default the director of White House Intergovernmental Affairs. The Department of Justice, and no one in particular at Justice. There's been several different lawyers from the Justice Department that have been in communications either on a call or within emails. The Department of Treasury, specifically a gentleman named Paul Warshel, who I believe is counsel within the Treasury Department. Assistant Secretary Doug Dominich from the Department of the Interior, along with his staff, the Director of the Department of the Interior, Nick Pula, and also Basil Otley, who's the Director of their Policy Office. So those have been the primary principals that have been in communication with us. From time to time, there have been solicitors involved, I believe, in a few emails from the Interior Department early on. I believe there was a solicitor also involved from the Treasury Department when we were trying to figure out different federal administrative remedies. The second question, how will GovGuam ensure that it'll be repaid? So this is dependent. GovGuam providing the funding, the local funding up front, will only get repaid with the passage of H.R. 1365. As many of us know, at the beginning of the congressional session, the Department of the Treasury had opined that it didn't have the authority to expend the money that was being collected from the Department of the Interior, which was above and beyond the $68 million, which is our annual Section 30 funding. So there's been an accumulation in that fund over, I think, just 2 years right now. But they have no authority to spend the money. And so Delegate St. Nicholas introduced a piece of legislation, actually two. The first one has kind of been forgotten about. He moved forward with the second legislation, which I know that the Treasury Department helped him craft. The current status of that legislation is that it had passed the House in July and was sent over to the Senate and was referred to the Senate Judiciary Committee. Only with the passage of that legislation that corrects the technical flaw will the Treasury Department be allowed to expend the funding. What doesn't occur is preventing the Department of the Interior from continuing to have to deposit into the War Claims Fund with the Treasury Department. And that's consistent with the Guam World War II Loyalty Recognition Act, which was passed in the National Defense Authorization Act a few years ago. So that will continue, and we have no control over that unless there's other legislative language that interrupts that flow of funding. The accountability to prevent a double payment. So this will be really an administrative function between the government of Guam and the Trump administration. What will occur conceptually is that after GovGuam pays out an award or to a claimant that's been adjudicated, then at some point during our process, we will report back to the Department of the Treasury, who would already have been aware of the names of claimants that GovGuam has received, because we will only receive them from the Department of the Treasury, and we will only do so by affirmation of the claimant who responds to a letter from Treasury indicating that GovGuam has created a local program to award claims in advance of the federal government, because the federal government is prohibited from expending funding out of the Department of the Treasury. And then after that affirmation, to share their personal information with the government of Guam, then Treasury will transmit that information to our appropriate agency, and I believe the legislation calls for the Department of Administration to be the effectuating agency within Government of Guam to carry out the local war claims. Our Department of Administration will then have to reach out to the claimants who we've been notified of by the Department of Treasury that they would like to be considered in the GovGuam program. The Department of Administration, in carrying out their responsibilities, will have to reach out to individual claimants, affirm from them that they want GovGuam to pay their claim, and then assign their claim back to the Government of Guam. After that assignment of a claim is received by the Government of Guam, then the Government of Guam will release a check in the amount of their adjudicated award. And then after that check has cleared the bank, we will report back to the Department of the Treasury the name of the person that was contacted, the cleared check in the amount of their adjudicated award, and their assignment of claim to the Government of Guam. It's the assignment of claim that allows the Government of Guam, once the Department of the Treasury is allowed to expend funding, allows them to reimburse Guam for the money that it had put up front. And that would prevent a double payment.
Sijos Masi, Mr. Babalta, thank you so much for that information. And just to be clear, in order to effectuate that, Mr. Chair, I'm going to go ahead and add an amendment. It's been passed out, and it will be on page 3, line 19, and it would be the line 19, page 3, to amend the bill to read, section 3, effective date. This act shall be effective upon the receipt of a memorandum of understanding between the United States government and the Government of Guam, which sets out the administrative process that must be adhered to in order for the Government of Guam to pay awards. This memorandum of understanding must be filed with the Guam Legislature prior to any funds being transferred. And then, of course, section 4 would be the severability clause, and which is self-explanatory, Mr. Chair, and I invite my colleagues to comment on this amendment. Just making sure that we have clarity there.
Do we have any questions from my colleagues? Yeah, she wants to move on. Senator Tello, you have a question, ma'am?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you to the panel.
On the amendment.
Oh, sorry.
Okay,
Yes.
on the amendment.
Yes. Thank you to the panel for being here today and explaining the steps and process in which to do this. The amendment that is proffered before us, Mr. Chair, as I'm reading it, trying to understand the purpose of this exactly, I mean, she read it, but if the good author could kind of explain in detail exactly why this amendment is needed.
Yes, I will yield to the question, Mr. Chair. Again, I just wanted to make sure that the effective date upon this passage of this legislation is that it would become effective when the MOU is signed by the United States government and the Gov Guam. Earlier, Mr. Chair, when we were first working on the draft resolution of this bill, the draft legislation on this bill, it was noticed that we wanted to have a breakdown of how the awards would be done, the effective date and all that. And when the draft legislation was sent to the federal government, they wanted to leave the administrative provisions to both the Government of Guam and the federal government. So we did not include that in the original bill. So I just want to make sure, Mr. Chair, that there's clarity there and that the effective date to be able to release the funding source that gets put into the 75th Guam 75th Guam Liberation War Claims Fund will be effectuated is when that MOU is given to this body and that we have signatures from both sides.
Senator Tello, do you have any?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to my colleague for explaining a little bit about what happened prior. However, you know, it's kind of, I'm trying to put my head around this with regards to any prior funds being transferred. Wouldn't the memorandum of understanding begin at the very beginning of the understanding between the U.S. Department of Treasury and the government of Guam to adhere to this process that Tony Babauta, Chief of Staff, mentioned earlier about a process? I mean, shouldn't a memorandum happen before any payments, like the process, like the Chief of Staff explained, meaning step one, somebody fills out the award claims, it then goes to the, goes through its process through the Congress office, and from there it then gets submitted to the U.S. Treasury for review, like he explained. I'm just kind of wondering, wouldn't that memorandum of understanding happen prior to? So that was my only concern. You know, Tony, can you maybe answer to that with regards to wouldn't a memorandum be understood at the very beginning of the process and not when it's time to pay out?
Tony?
Should the legislation pass and signed into law, the government of Guam would not be able to effectuate the legislation without a memorandum of understanding or agreement with the Department of the Treasury, which sets out everything in terms of process. A concern that I would have in looking at the amendment, just to ensure, because I know it was a concern of the Department of the Treasury, is to keep the privacy of individuals private. And I don't imagine that anything in our memorandum of understanding or agreement with the Department of Treasury would reveal the names of those people, but I just know that it was a concern. So if there's any, as other eyes take a look at this, if you see something that that could be concerning with respect to revealing any private information of an individual or of a claimant, then I would caution that we pay attention to that.
Thank you, Tony, for that. And I'm really trying to write down everything you said on the process, because the process is important. You know, the step-by-step on how everybody is being adhered to.
Yeah.
And I don't see the process in the bill. I don't see anything in here showing that this is the steps that will be taken for the war reparations and the process. Only that, prior to an MOU must be put in place. An MOU for what? That you're going to follow a process, but the process is not explained here, only from verbatim what you said. So, Mr. Chair, if I can have a moment with the author, and I do adhere to what you say with regards to privacy. And this, maybe this might be the opportunity to put it in this amendment, or maybe another amendment proffering. So, Mr. Chair, can I get a minute with the author of the amendment, please?
Yes. We'll have a minute recess.
Yeah, I'm okay.
Ladies and gentlemen, we're back from recess. Let's continue on with the bill. Let's,
Mr. Chair, if I may, I would just like to, at this time, just move to set aside this amendment. Go
Yes.
ahead and hear from my colleagues, and then after everything is heard and this amendment still seems clear to get this process moving forward, then I was, so on the motion to set aside, to set it aside at this time, Mr. Chair, if I
yes,
may.
yes, Madam Speaker, we will set that aside, and any other amendments will not be entertained until we reach that point.
Thank you, Mr.
Okay,
Chair.
let's just stay on track, and let's get to the questions. The other sponsors would like to speak about the bill, and I would like to have them speak. We'll start with Senator Castro, and then Senator Amanda Shelton, and then we will begin questions, starting with Senator Teresa Lyer, immediately after. Would you like to be the one to start? I can start. Okay. So
He was first. Him.
okay, so Senator Will, you're up, and then Senator Amanda, we follow right after you. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, I want to extend an undangkulong na sidusmasi to Imagat Haga Guahan, the Honorable Lourdes Leon Guerrero, and also to the Speaker, my colleague of the 35th Guam Legislature, primarily for reaching out to me, Mr. Chairman, for the opportunity to weigh the bill on the merit, contents of the bill as it was written. And I gotta say, this is consistent with the previous speaker's concerns that initially I too was very reluctant, Mr. Chairman, very reluctant, because I wasn't certain on the mechanism by which we would administer the bill. And without going into the amendment itself, Mr. Speaker, which she had graciously set aside, I'd like to weigh in on that conversation as well. But I do want to state for the record that it wasn't until I conducted my due diligence on the bill itself, looking back in time on the long legislative record, the congressional record, and the Guam record as it relates to this specific movement forward to provide some kind of relief to that generation. You see, Mr. Chairman, also, it wasn't until I had multiple conversations with the administration, with the governor herself, with the chief of staff, with other members of this body, that I was able to understand how the process itself would carry itself out, particularly through this mechanism that will be entertained further in terms of a flowchart, the promulgation of this bill. I don't intend on going into the particulars at this point in time, Mr. Chairman, that I can present to the body in terms of how I justified my desire and approval to sign on as a co-sponsor alongside the Speaker and Senator Shelton. But I would like to say, based on the facts, which I'm prepared to present throughout this hopefully fruitful discourse, Mr. Chairman, that I find this bill to be not only pragmatic and not only just the right thing to do, but I think it makes sense. And so I'm going to go ahead and offer my remarks on the bill in general, and I'll start with this. Thank you again, Madam Speaker. Speaker and members of the 35th Guam Legislature, after having reviewed the record, I cannot overemphasize how important Bill 181 is for our Manamco, the war survivors and their families. Each year for the last 75 years, Mr. Chairman, our community has commemorated Guam's liberation. For the last 75 years, our community has rallied in support of those who survived World War II. And during this same period, we have held countless memorials, ceremonial events, and remembrances of that bleeding time in history. And rightfully so. During this period, countless speeches were made, plaques, certificates were issued, commemorative sites and statues constructed in honor of war survivors, and equally as important, those who perished during Guam's initial invasion, her subsequent occupation, and thankfully, her eventual liberty. And rightfully so. Unfortunately, for many years, and despite admirable efforts, unpaid war claims have also been wrongfully remembered. It is impossible for our Manamco war survivors and their families to truly progress from that period of time because of the wrongs that have yet to be made right. Still, 75 years later, Madam Speaker, my good colleagues, may we be the generation that provides a sense of wholeness to the greatest generation. I ask that you please join me in support of Bill 181. Let us make unpaid war claims a thing of the past. Sejus Masi. Mr. Chairman, I would like to leave as a point of information for the body's consideration so I can come back to this before the rest of my time is expired. If you look back on the legislative record, I found it very unique that this concept of war claims, not to make that generation whole, Madam Speaker, but to provide some kind of relief. This is not relegated strictly to the wartime atrocities of beheadings, internments, forced marches, etc. If you look back on the congressional record, I found it unique. I found it unique that it's been acknowledged by Congress that after that moment, after they came back on July 21st, 1941, for which I am extremely and profoundly grateful, there was a period of continued occupation, a period of continued displacement, Mr. Chairman. So in my humble mind, from my perspective, this compensation package, this compensation initiative, thanks to the wisdom of the Speaker and the Governor, and for the privilege to be involved, sets up the local mechanism by which we can promulgate certain actions of Congress. But Mr. Speaker, Mr. Chairman, may we be reminded that war claims and compensation was not strictly, at least on its face in the initial era of this moving forward, as passed in 1944, by the way, was not predicated solely on wartime atrocities done by the Imperial Japanese. It was in acknowledgement of the continued displacement of this great Chamorro nation. Hongi.
Thank you, Senator Castro. Senator Shelton.
Sejus Masi, Mr. Chair, and Sejus Masi to the panel for being here today to answer our questions. And I'd like to thank our colleagues as well for participating in this exercise so that we can answer all the questions that we have regarding the process and bring to light how this will all work so we can finally put this issue to rest. Earlier in this term, we passed a resolution, Resolution 36-35, which I, along with Senator Bisco-Lee and the Speaker, introduced to express our unwavering support for either a congressional or an administrative fix for our war claims. So I was honored that the body's support for our resolution, we passed that, and I did go to Washington, D.C. with the resolution and showed it to members of Congress, presented it to members of Congress, including the Speaker, Nancy Pelosi, during the Liberation Day festivities. And so I know that all of us were elated to see H.R. 1365 make progress in the House. And we look forward to the progress to be made in the Senate, which I believe the bill was recently referred to the Judiciary Committee. So we continue to support that passage. My co-sponsorship of Bill 181-35 honors this resolution, 36-35, and this body's support for an administrative solution to war claims. This two-pronged approach to tackling this issue can only speed up the war claims process for our war survivors. The unfortunate reality is that we are losing more and more of our war survivors as the years pass, and we must bring closure to this as soon as possible. I've personally sat with war survivors sometimes for hours at a time as they recounted their experiences during the war. For many, they were recounting things that they had never told their families because it was too painful. For 75 years, they've waited for restitution, they've waited for recognition, and for 75 years, our war survivors have waited for closure. So I think we take this step here today with Bill 181 to bring this fight full circle. From Senator Cecilia Cruz Bamba, who was a war survivor herself, who was among the first to champion this cause, to today, the generations of our island have contributed to this shared struggle for justice. And just as the previous speakers have thanked the different delegates who have worked hard to pass this legislation in the U.S. Congress, I'd like to thank them as well, and all the others who've advocated for this recognition for our war survivors. So while we continue to fight for justice with this federal bureaucracy, let our Manamku wait no longer for a resolution they righteously deserve. So I ask today that my colleagues support this, and I look forward to having our panel here today explain this process to us and clear up any reservations that we may have. Siduos Masi, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Senator Shelton. Do we have any questions from my colleagues? And I will start with Senator Nelson, then we will go to your right and then snake through the
Thank you,
panel.
Mr.
Thank
Chair. Maybe just a question or two. It states in the bill, Imagahagan Guahan is authorized to transfer a sum not to exceed $7.5 million. Does the $7.5 million cover all applicants that have applied for war claims and those that are eligible?
The $7.5 million does not cover the entire universe of claimants. The Congressional Budget Office, when it had, in its most recent scoring of H.R. 1365, which is very similar to the scoring of the Guam World War II Loyalty Recognition Act when it was passed, estimates that the total cost to resolve additional awards will probably be like around between $30 and $40 million. The $7.5 million represents what the administration has been told early on by the Trump administration of the first batch of claimants that had been awarded. So it reached up to a level of $7.5 million. The governor believes that that's the amount that we can move forward with in trying to bring some immediate resolution and parity to our survivors of Guam's World War II occupation. The payments themselves, once carried out either by Treasury or the government of Guam, will only be, actually under this piece of legislation, will only be carried out for survivors for survivors of the war who remain with us today, and will only cover up to $7.5 million. That's where our ceiling is. We are hopeful that with the continued persistence of delegates in Nicholas, as well as all elected leadership on Guam, that the passage of H.R. 1365 would occur and be able to continue the operations of war claims.
So I'm confused.
Okay.
Are you saying that the applicants that are still alive is what the $7.5 million will address?
Correct.
So you're saying that there's only an X amount of people alive that will warrant the payout of $7.5 million? What is the population?
There are more survivors from occupation that will exceed the $7.5 million.
Are they still alive, or you're just counting for
No, they're still alive.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, the $7.5 million does not represent the universe of survivors.
that are alive today?
Correct.
Okay.
There's a larger universe of survivors that merit an award. The $7.5 million represents essentially the first batch of claims that were adjudicated by the Foreign Claims Settlement Commission.
Okay. And how many survivors are that? How many survivors are there that we are looking?
How many will the $7.5
Yes.
million? It's averaging about, it seems to be $10,000 per survivor. So I think I think that represents 750?
750 survivors.
Yeah, approximately. I don't have an exact number, Vice Speaker.
And how many will be remaining after the payout?
I'm not clear. I believe that it was reported at the time that the window was open to submit your claims for the suffering that you received as a result of occupation.
So we don't have a statistic, or I'm sorry, not a statistic, a status of how many of our war survivors are alive today that have claimed and that have been approved, just this first batch of 750 survivors?
I don't know that there's a complete roster. There's an estimation. One, there's an estimation, and then two, there's a data point for when war claims were filed with
Right.
with the Foreign Claims Settlement Commission. I believe at that point it was about 3,300 war claims were
Processed?
were filed
Okay.
to be adjudicated, but that entire number doesn't necessarily represent survivors alone, because the universe of people that are eligible
Yes.
include both survivors and heirs.
Yes, the descendants. So how will you determine the priority of which survivor is awarded, not awarded, but which survivor is given this war claim? Because,
Well, we would ask the Treasury Department to submit the 750 from the first batch, and there wouldn't be no priority. It would be what we could cover.
okay, so there's a first batch. Do we know of a second and a third batch?
There will be other claims that that will be awarded or that will be adjudicated by the Foreign Claims Settlement Commission. There will be other survivors beyond the $7.5 million.
But we don't know who they are right now?
No, no, we don't know who they are. I think only the Foreign Claims Settlement Commission knows who they are by virtue of them filing a claim. We're hopeful again that with the passage of local legislation to speed up on a local level the process, that gives Delegate San Nicolas the time necessary for Congress's consideration of his legislation that makes the technical amendment that's needed for the Department of the Treasury to carry out what we are doing for them in this first round.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you,
Thank you,
ma'am.
Mr. Chair. I think it's very important that we make these constraints very clear, because 7.5 million is not going to go to all of the survivors that are alive today and some that are deceased to the heirs. It's not going to go to that. It's going to go to a first batch of applicants, and I think we need to keep on saying this, because when we say, oh, we're going to file for, that the governor have this kind of transfer authority to pay our war survivors, it might be a little bit unclear, and I'm sure that everyone is anticipating this. And I think we also need to mention the elephant in the room. The previous speaker did mention that there was a concern that there was no representative from the congressman's office. And really, we need to understand that avenue of approach that he's taking, and ensure that we are working cohesively together, so that we don't step on his toes and he doesn't step on our toes either in what we're trying to do here to ensure that the survivors are given what they've been waiting for so many years. I think we also need to establish that and make that very clear and understand his side, and ensure that we are working together and not trying to do something divisive where it could undermine his approach to ensuring that these claims are filed, but that we are working as one unit for our Manamco to ensure that I don't even want to say given their just due, because I still think it's a slap in the face for the little amount that they had to have applied for that is granted to us by the federal government. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Senator.
If I could just speak
Tony?
to, with respect to any conflicts between what the local legislature is considering and what Congress is considering, that's very well known in our conversations with the Department of Treasury and the Trump administration. The Secretary of the Interior, as well as the Treasury Department, which helped craft the legislation in collaboration with Congressman San Nicolas, are all very well aware and have been given the local legislation that you're considering today. There's nothing that conflicts with each other, nor do your efforts here or the governor's efforts hamper the forward movement of Mr. San Nicolas's legislation. In fact, Governor Leon Guerrero has endorsed and expressed that legislation should move forward as quickly as possible. I know members of this body have also made that expression to members of Congress as well. But I understand the concern.
Yes, yes, there is a great concern because we see it, right? We hear the concern from Mr. St. Nicholas via Facebook, perhaps, but we need to really understand if this is something good that can help move the process forward, or is this something that will hinder his efforts? And so I think that needs to be very clear, because if we don't want to have a battle between this is something very, the word important does not even meet the gravity of this, right? This is something dealing with my grandparents, our grandparents, surviving the war and having us here today. And so it's something that we really need to approach as a unified body, because that is the values that our grandparents or our parents instilled in us, is to work together, to forgive, to move forward. And so we really don't want to hinder his approach. And I don't know, I'm still hoping that we can have a representative from his office or someone say, yes, this is something good, and we're working on it together, because we all have this link to our grandparents who survived the war.
I couldn't.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
I couldn't agree with you more. I don't think in my conversations with the Trump administration, both at the White House level and the Treasury Department, that they are aware, again, of what the approach that we're taking locally, and that you are considering, as well as what has moved out of the House and is being considered in the Senate.
I understand that. I understand that, Tony, but I don't hear Mr. St. Nicholas's name, that we're working closely with Mr. St. Nicholas in there, and that's my concern.
We're keeping Mr. St. Nicholas apprised of everything that we're doing.
Absolutely, but are we getting a response?
Okay,
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Senator. Now, Senator Lee.
Buenos, Mr. Chair, and to Dos Masi, to you and the gentlemen who have joined us, Mr. Carlson, Mr. Byrne, and Mr. Babauta. I do also want to register my concern, Mr. Chair, and I wanted to just ask you again if Mr. St. Nicholas's office or representative will be joining our discussions today.
Senator, his office was called. Mrs. Wynn, the district director, said she was busy and she would call back, and we got the same response just a few minutes ago. So I'm going to safely assume no one's going to attend.
Mr. Chair, I'll continue with my line of questioning in that case, but I hope that we can continue to reach out to the delegate's office and ensure that maybe somebody after lunch would be able to join us, as it's imperative that we get their side of the story on this piece of legislation moving forward. That being said, on page 3, line 13, and it's been mentioned by Mr. Babauta and others about the memorandum of agreement. So I just wanted to get a little bit more background and allow my colleagues and those watching on TV to understand a little bit better. Maybe this is a question for Mr. Babauta. So if you could give us a little bit of background on the process. So the process of getting the Department of Treasury to sign on for a memorandum of agreement with Gov Guam. Have we ever done that in the past? And what would be the process to accomplish that goal?
I think in general, Gov Guam has signed different memorandums of agreements or understanding with other federal agencies, as well as with other governments like the CNMI.
But with Treasury in particular?
With the Treasury Department in particular, I don't have the institutional knowledge on the executive branch side. Do we have any memorandums of agreements with the Department of Treasury that are active?
Yes, we do, primarily through the interaction of the Department of Revenue and Taxation.
Okay.
Mrs. Usmasi.
So, with respect to, well, we wouldn't enter into a MOA any differently. We would, the MOA would spell out exactly what the responsibilities of the Department of Treasury would be and what the responsibilities of our government of Guam would be, and lay out that process, right? So just to be clear again, the initial contact will be from the Department of the Treasury to a claimant who has an award. And in short, it will notify the claimant that the Department of Treasury is currently unable to fulfill the mandate of the Guam World War II Loyalty Recognition Act. However, the government of Guam has passed legislation or is enacting a law, implementing a law that could allow their award to be paid for by the government of Guam. The claimant would have to affirm, or let me take one step back, and then the Department of Treasury would have to ask the claimant, because of privacy laws, if it is okay for them, for the Department of the Treasury, to share their private information, which includes their name, their mailing address, the amount of award, other information that's necessary, with the government of Guam. This is going to be an exchange of paper. No one's going to be standing in line at any department or at any office. If a claimant affirms that they want to share their information with the government of Guam, then the Department of the Treasury communicates that to the government of Guam, and then the government of Guam has a responsibility to then reach out to the claimant and say, we have been informed that you want your claim to be considered to be adjudicated or awarded by the government of Guam under the 75th Guam War Claims Fund that was enacted. And in order for that to happen, they would have to send a document back, and the legal instruments will be within the communications. They would have to affirm that they want their claim to be awarded by the government of Guam, and then assign their claim, their existing claim, that they've already received from the Department of the Treasury to the government of Guam, because that is going to be our method in reporting back to the Department of the Treasury of how we get reimbursed. So we put out $7.5 million. We got to make sure that we have all the documents in place, which would equal the $7.5 million, which includes the assignment of claim from an individual and also the canceled check after we have issued a check, and then it's cashed by the claimant. And we would send that information along with the individual and everything else back to the Department of Treasury. And that would be our reporting requirement to them.
Thank you very much. I also had a few questions about privacy, but you've answered those. So just being clear that if GovGuam ends up cutting the checks, if this bill passes, then that information wouldn't necessarily be private, because we'd have to share that information, like the name of the claimant, how much the award would be, with other GovGuam entities like DOA and DRT in order for that process to happen. So the Treasury would reach out to those claimants and let them know in advance and then give them the option, correct?
Correct. A claimant could absolutely say, you know what, I want to wait for the Department of the Treasury to make my claim, so I'm not going to allow the Department of Treasury to share my personal information with the government of Guam. And if that's the case, then that's fine. That's a claimant's decision, and their claim will get entertained at the time that the Department of the Treasury is given the appropriate authority to disperse checks.
Thank you very much. I also, on that vein, I wanted to ask you, can you share any correspondence that you might have had with the Department of Treasury that outlines or that indicates how Treasury, or if Treasury has the administrative jurisdiction or administrative authority to assign these claims to the government of Guam as you had outlined?
The conversations have been with, I believe his title is Chief Counsel, and the White House has been on the line in our communications. Early on, there was this issue of privacy that lawyers on their side had to vet. I had not asked for, we had not asked them for their opinion, but they did come back into the conversation and gave assurances sought assurances within their department, within the Treasury Department, and then communicated their assurances with the Justice Department, the Interior Department, and the White House that they had the authority to be able to do this. I can go back and check, however, if there's any opinion that they created internally, and I'll see if I could share that with you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Chair, I just wanted to clarify, are we going to have multiple rounds of questioning or just, okay. So I'll reserve some of the questions that I have for my second round, but I just do want to state for the record that I want to extend an Ndunkluna Sidusmasi to our Magahaga, to the author of this bill and the co-sponsors. I think everyone in this room can agree that our Manamku, our greatest generation, so, you know, they deserve to be paid this claim, and I think that it's imperative that we iron out the details and in hopes that we can get them paid as soon as possible. And I think that's the effort behind this, so I certainly applaud the effort, but it's important that we cross our T's, dot our I's, and make sure that we're doing this in a way that honors their sacrifice. Situsmasi.
Thank you, Senator Lee. Before we go forward, we're gonna recess. There is communication with Delegate Senecla's office, so we'll recess until 2 o'clock, and then we'll resume with Bill 181. All right? Thank you.